The scream tore through the air, sharp and raw, as Emily felt the ground collapse beneath the fragile life she had built. Her breath shook as betrayal cracked across her chest like thunder. The office lights buzzed above, cold and indifferent. She had trusted them, yet trust had become the knife pressed against her ribs. Her hands trembled, gripping the edge of the desk until her knuckles whitened. The voices of her colleagues twisted into cruel echoes, words poisoned with disbelief. Emily said, "Why now when I have nothing left to fight with?" A bitter laugh rose from someone nearby, mocking the silence that followed. Shadows stretched across her face, reminding her she had lived too long unseen. She had been quiet, careful, invisible, but invisibility could not shield her now. Emily's chest heaved as tears fought to escape, but she swallowed them back, each one burning like fire in her throat. Her heart whispered of weakness, but her soul demanded defiance. In that moment rage rose, tangled with sorrow, and she understood this was not the end. It was the breaking point. The silence after the scream was heavier than the scream itself. Emily stood frozen, her chest rising and falling, each breath jagged and loud in her ears. David's smirk lingered like a stain, mocking her collapse. Emily said, "I trusted you and you let me burn." Her voice cracked, but the sound carried sharpness, like broken glass across a floor. David did not answer, only turned his back with cold indifference. Emily's thoughts spiraled, memories of every moment she stayed quiet, every moment she avoided the spotlight, thinking safety was in silence. But safety had betrayed her. She thought of her late nights, her endless efforts, her ignored victories, now turned into a cruel spectacle. For years she had begged fate for recognition, and when recognition arrived, it came as ridicule. She swallowed, her throat dry, her resolve rattling but unbroken. Alone, stripped of illusions, she saw herself not as a victim, but as a woman at war. Emily felt her breath hitch as silence settled like smoke. She remembered childhood evenings, sitting quietly in corners, told to stay invisible, told her voice did not matter. Now those echoes became daggers. She whispered, "Not anymore." The air was heavy, her palms damp, but her spine slowly straightened. She was not weak. Weakness was the mask she wore for survival. The fluorescent hum seemed louder, drilling into her head as if daring her to collapse. She clenched her jaw until it ached. Every second was a war inside her chest. Yet in the quiet fury, Emily saw the faint outline of courage, not roaring, but whispering, urging her forward. She had been silent her entire life, but silence would no longer shield her. Tonight, silence would become her weapon. David's footsteps faded, leaving Emily in the echo of her unraveling world. Her heart pounded as though to break free, but with each thud she remembered why she could not falter. Her family's tired faces, her mother's whispered doubt, her own shame at being overlooked. Emily said, "I cannot be nothing anymore." Her voice steadied, though low. The room's coldness no longer chilled her, it ignited her. Pain shaped her, betrayal carved her, but beneath the scars was steel. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, saw the girl she once was, silent and small, and let her vanish. In her place stood a woman who would not break. The office no longer looked familiar, it was a battlefield where she had been ambushed. Emily's eyes narrowed, seeing the walls not as barriers, but as witnesses to her vow. She whispered, "They will not erase me." Her voice, though quiet, vibrated with fury. She bent down, gathering the scattered papers, her hands steady now. Each page she lifted was a symbol of the life that had crumbled, yet she no longer trembled. David's absence mattered little. What mattered was her decision. Survival was no longer hiding, it was fighting. The cold fluorescent lights dimmed in her perception, as though the world shrank to her and her defiance. She pressed the papers against her chest, spine tall, eyes forward. In this moment she was not broken. She was standing alone, and that was enough. Emily walked home beneath a sky heavy with clouds, the city buzzing with careless life around her. Her thoughts dragged her backward to nights of her childhood, when she pressed her ear against thin apartment walls, hearing neighbors fight and her mother whispering doubts about her future. She remembered shrinking into corners, hiding her dreams because they made others laugh. Tonight, those echoes felt alive, clawing at her chest. Emily said, "I was always told to stay small." She stopped on the sidewalk, breath fogging in the cold air, as if waiting for an answer from the night. The silence mocked her, yet it carried a strange invitation. She could not stay small anymore. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, but her spine held straight. The past had been a chain, but chains could be broken. She pressed her hand to her chest, as though steadying a fire within. She was no longer a silent girl. She was the woman who must rise. Inside her apartment, the silence was almost suffocating. Emily dropped her bag by the door and sank into the old armchair where she had cried so many nights before. The walls were thin, paint peeling, but they carried the weight of her years in hiding. She thought of every job she had worked, every time her ideas were dismissed, every time she was told she wasn't ready. The words clung to her like smoke. Emily whispered, "I have lived in shadows too long." Her voice echoed faintly in the small room, startling even her. She looked around at the scattered books and unpaid bills, reminders of her fragile existence. But the fragility was only surface. Beneath it, steel waited. Her pulse quickened as she realized she wasn't afraid of silence anymore. She was afraid of never stepping beyond it. The next morning, sunlight pushed through the blinds, stripes of light cutting across her tired face. Emily stood before the mirror, staring at the woman reflected back. She traced the lines of worry etched into her skin, the quiet strength hidden beneath weary eyes. She whispered, "This is who I am, but not who I will remain." For years she had thought blending in was survival, but now she saw it had been surrender. She pulled her hair back tightly, her movements deliberate, as if preparing for battle. The world had dismissed her, overlooked her, but the mirror showed no victim. It showed a survivor ready to become something more. She felt the shift inside her, small but undeniable, a whisper turning into a voice. Later that day at work, the office hummed with noise, but Emily moved through it like a shadow, no longer afraid of being seen. Colleagues whispered, some eyes flicking toward her, but she kept her gaze forward. David leaned near the break room, his smirk faint but sharp enough to wound. Emily said, "Not today," under her breath, her jaw tightening. She walked past him, each step steadier than the last, carrying the weight of her vow. Fear still gnawed, but alongside it came something new, an ember of courage. It did not roar, but it glowed. She understood she was being tested, and this was only the beginning. That evening, Emily sat at her small kitchen table, papers spread before her, hands steady. Bills, rejection letters, reminders of everything she had endured surrounded her like soldiers of defeat. Yet she did not crumble. She leaned forward, breathing deeply, and said, "I will not bow to this anymore." Her voice, though quiet, cut through the stale air like a blade. The weight of years pressed on her shoulders, but she carried it without bending. For the first time in her life, she wasn't wishing for rescue, she was preparing for resistance. The world had made her small, but smallness would no longer hold her. She lifted her chin, eyes burning, as if daring fate itself to strike again. The office felt colder the next morning, whispers crawling through the air like venom. Emily walked past desks where coworkers stared too long, their silence sharp as accusations. Every glance carried weight, every laugh cut into her. She wanted to hide, but her vow from last night held her still. Emily said, "They will not crush me." Yet her voice cracked as if betraying doubt. She sat at her desk, papers piled high, hands trembling. David passed, his smirk deliberate, and whispered something to another colleague who chuckled. Heat rose in her chest, anger tangled with shame. Her stomach knotted, but her eyes stayed fixed forward. The walls seemed to close in, but Emily's breath slowed, steadying with every second. This was not defeat, this was her trial. She had endured worse, and she would not let their shadows devour her light. As hours dragged on, Emily buried herself in work, though each keystroke felt heavy. Her thoughts screamed louder than the office chatter. She remembered years of invisible labor, credits stolen, efforts dismissed. Her chest ached with the weight of injustice, yet inside burned a quiet flame. Emily whispered, "Not this time." She felt every obstacle pressing closer, yet the resistance inside her grew stronger. David walked past again, dropping a file onto her desk with force, the sound echoing like a challenge. She did not flinch. She lifted her chin, eyes steady, and forced her hands to move calmly across the pages. The battle was silent but fierce. Each breath she took was defiance, every glance forward was armor. She was not broken. She was holding the line. By noon, exhaustion pressed heavy on Emily's shoulders. She stepped into the break room for water, but silence followed her. Two co-workers hushed their laughter when she entered, their eyes darting. Emily said, "I see you," though the words were only in her head. She gripped the counter, staring at her reflection in the steel coffee pot. The woman staring back was worn, but her eyes carried fire. The more they pushed her down, the more she felt herself standing taller inside. She swallowed hard, forcing the tremor in her hands to still. She would not give them the victory of watching her falter. Every smirk, every whisper was fuel. They thought she was weak, but weakness had already been burned away. Only steel remained. Later that day, Emily crossed paths with Daniel, a colleague who had always kept to himself. His eyes studied her for a moment, then he muttered, "They want you to fold." His voice was flat, but edged with something sharper. Emily felt a strange jolt. Someone had noticed. She said, "I won't give them that." Daniel's brow lifted slightly, a hint of approval hidden beneath his cynicism. He leaned closer and whispered, "Then stop looking like you already lost." The word stung, but beneath the sting was truth. Emily's chest tightened, but she nodded faintly. The moment was brief, but it shifted something inside her. She was not entirely alone. She had been tested, but now she had a mirror reflecting her strength back at her. As the day ended, Emily sat at her desk long after others had left. The silence pressed in, but it was not suffocating. It was steadying. She replayed Daniel's words in her mind, each one sharpening her resolve. She whispered, "Stop looking like I lost." She straightened her shoulders, placed the rejection-stamped papers in front of her, and stared them down as though facing an enemy. No tears came now, only focus. This was not just about surviving today. It was about rewriting her place entirely. The world had told her she was small, forgettable, unworthy. She was done listening. She was preparing for war, and war required standing, even when the ground shook beneath her. Emily sat alone at her desk, the office dim with only a few lights humming above. The weight of the day pressed hard, voices from her past crashing in like waves. Every insult, every dismissal, every reminder that she was never enough clawed inside her. She closed her eyes, breath sharp, as if suffocating under invisible chains. The rejection stamped across her papers stared back, red and cruel. Emily whispered, "I cannot carry this forever." Her throat tightened, eyes burning, tears threatening. She pressed her palms against her forehead, trembling with the urge to surrender. For the first time in years, the temptation of giving up whispered sweetly, promising release. Her chest heaved as the thought crept closer, but deep beneath the ache, something rebelled. It was faint, but it was fire. Even in her lowest moment, the voice inside refused to die. The walls of the office felt tighter, pressing in until Emily could barely breathe. She looked at the papers again, the weight of them, unbearable. David's laughter echoed faintly in her memory, sharper than any knife. Emily whispered, "Maybe they were right." Her voice cracked, filled with exhaustion. She felt the crushing heaviness of years spent fighting shadows, the humiliation of being unseen, the pain of being overlooked. Her hands shook, her chest heavy with despair. But as her tears slid silently down her face, a thought stabbed through. Surrender meant letting them win. She inhaled, slow and sharp, the air burning her lungs. She clenched her fists and forced her shoulders back. Giving up would kill the fire that refused to die. She couldn't do that. Not tonight. Not ever again. The door creaked, and Daniel stepped into the silence. He glanced at Emily, his face unreadable. She wiped her cheeks quickly, straightening as though hiding her collapse. Daniel said, "You're letting them win." His voice was blunt, cold, but laced with something sharper, truth. Emily's eyes widened, fury sparking through her shame. "You think I don't know that?" she snapped, her voice trembling. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms, watching her like someone waiting for her to wake up. He said, "Then stop breaking in front of them. Start fighting back." His words pierced deeper than cruelty. They cut through to the part of her that still burned. Emily swallowed hard, shoulders squaring. The weakness remained, but the fire now flickered stronger. Daniel's words lingered in the silence like a blade. Emily stared at him, chest rising and falling, as if every breath was battle. For years she had built walls to survive, but walls were not strength. They were cages. Daniel said, "You're stronger than you think, but no one's going to hand it to you." His voice was low, harsh, but carried weight. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears, fear gnawing at her ribs, but defiance pushing harder. She whispered, "Then I'll take it." The words shook, but they were hers. For the first time she felt the chain of doubt slip slightly loose. Daniel gave a faint nod, then turned away, leaving her alone. Alone, but no longer broken. Emily sat in silence, long after Daniel left, his words burning in her chest. She stared at the rejection-stamped papers, once symbols of defeat, now fuel for defiance. She whispered, "This ends here." The despair that had nearly consumed her hardened into resolve. She pressed her palms flat on the desk, steady, unshaken. The weight on her shoulders hadn't vanished, but she carried it differently now, like armor instead of chains. She wasn't waiting for recognition anymore. She was preparing to demand it. Her reflection in the dark computer screen stared back, no longer hollow, but alive with fire. Emily breathed deep, steadying herself. Tonight, she had bent, but she had not broken. Tomorrow she would rise. The next day, Emily arrived early, the office still cloaked in morning quiet. She sifted through files left on her desk, but one caught her eye, documents marked confidential. Her breath caught as she flipped through them. Inside were reports altered, numbers twisted, signatures forged. Her chest tightened. She whispered, "This wasn't me. This was them." Her heart pounded as she realized the betrayal went deeper than whispers. Someone had used her silence as a shield for their corruption. The mockery, the rejection, it had been planted, deliberate. She felt fury rise, sharp and burning. For years she had been invisible, and now she saw why. She wasn't weak. She was convenient. And they had built their lies on her back. Emily's hands shook as she clutched the papers, every page cutting like a blade. She whispered, "They buried me to cover themselves." Her voice was low, filled with rage. Every laugh, every dismissal made sense now. It wasn't her failures. It was their theft. She thought of David, his smirk, his cruelty, and realized he was not mocking her weakness but protecting his lies. The thought ignited something raw inside. She had lived years in silence, but silence had been their weapon, not hers. Now, it was broken. Emily rose from her chair, fire in her veins. She was not the fool they thought. She was the storm they feared. David entered, casual as ever, sipping his coffee. His eyes narrowed when he saw Emily holding the papers. She lifted her gaze, steady, no longer trembling. Emily said, "You think I don't see it now?" David's smirk faltered, just for a second. It was enough. The power shifted, and she felt it pulse through her. His mask cracked, exposing the truth behind the arrogance. She realized he wasn't untouchable. He was terrified of exposure. That fear became her weapon. For years she had shrunk beneath his shadow, but shadows disappear when faced with fire. Emily straightened, papers clutched like proof of war. She was ready. Emily stepped closer, her voice low but sharp. She said, "You used me to hide your lies." David's jaw tightened, but he forced a chuckle. His silence spoke louder than his words. For the first time, Emily wasn't afraid of his smirk. She saw through it, saw the fear trembling beneath the surface. Her pulse quickened, not from dread but from power. She was no longer the quiet shadow. She was the storm, the reckoning. David muttered, "You don't know what you're doing." Emily replied, "I know exactly what I'm doing." The words left her lips like fire, sealing her defiance. The office buzzed as coworkers began arriving, unaware of the storm brewing. Emily stood tall, papers in hand, her eyes locked on David. He shifted uncomfortably, his arrogance fading. Emily whispered, "This ends with me." The words echoed louder than shouts, steady as stone. She no longer carried doubt. She carried truth. For years, she had been their shield, their scapegoat, their silence. No longer. Her defiance burned brighter than their shadows. She was not invisible. She was undeniable. The war had begun, and Emily was no longer afraid. The air in the office thickened as Emily stood, holding the papers like weapons forged from truth. Colleagues turned, whispers rippling like wind through dry leaves. David's smirk returned, though weaker, as he muttered, "You don't have the power to touch me." But Emily didn't flinch. She said, "I don't need power. I have proof." The weight of the moment pressed on her chest, but her voice was steady, slicing through the room with clarity. She laid the papers on the table, the red ink, forged numbers, and falsified signatures staring back at the room like undeniable wounds. For the first time, silence favored her. Every eye watched David, waiting. The ground no longer shook beneath her, it shook beneath him. David stepped forward, his voice sharp, laced with panic. "You don't know what you're talking about," he snapped, trying to summon control. Emily's chest rose as she steadied herself. She replied, "I know exactly what you've done." Every syllable dripped with fire. David's eyes darted, searching for escape, but the walls had closed in. Emily's colleagues began murmuring, their doubt now aimed at him. The silence of years that had buried her now became the stage for her defiance. She pressed her palms onto the desk and leaned forward, gaze locked on him. Her voice cut like a blade. "Your lies end here." The tension exploded when David slammed his fist onto the desk, his anger spilling into the room. He shouted, "You think anyone will believe you?" But Emily didn't flinch. Her voice was quiet, but its steadiness roared louder than his rage. "They already do," she said, her eyes cutting into his. The murmurs grew louder. Co-workers leaned forward, studying the evidence she had laid out. For years she had bent beneath their gazes, but now every gaze lifted her higher. David's fury faltered, his breath uneven. The truth had cornered him. Emily felt her own chest rise, not with fear, but with victory. Daniel stepped forward, breaking his usual silence. His voice was blunt but steady. "We've all seen it. We just never had the proof." His words cracked the air, shifting the tide fully. Emily turned to him, her eyes flickering with something rare, gratitude. For years she had fought alone, but in this moment she wasn't alone anymore. David's face drained of color, his silence now an admission. Emily said, "You tried to bury me, but you buried yourself." Her voice rang clear, not trembling, not small. It was the sound of victory, earned through fire. The chains of invisibility shattered completely. Confrontation ended not with David's roar, but with his silence. He slumped into his chair, his power stripped away, his lies exposed. Emily stood above him, papers still in hand, her heart pounding like a war drum. Yet she did not tremble. She whispered, "This is what standing feels like." Her voice was not for him, it was for herself. The years of silence, the years of invisibility, they ended here. She was no longer the shadow. She was the fire. The room was silent, but it was a silence that belonged to her now. The office was quiet after the storm. David avoided every eye, But Emily no longer cared. She returned to her desk, sat down, and exhaled deeply. Her chest still pounded, but the air tasted different, freer, lighter. She touched the papers, no longer trembling. For the first time, she saw them not as symbols of defeat, but of victory. Emily whispered, "I am not invisible anymore." Her words carried softly, but they echoed inside her louder than any shout. She had claimed her place, not given, but taken. Later, she stepped outside into the crisp air, the city alive with its usual chaos. But everything looked different. She no longer walked small, no longer kept her eyes down. Emily said, "This world may not welcome me, but it will see me." Her voice was quiet, but steady. She inhaled the cold air, every breath fueling her resolve. She had survived storms before, but this time she had chosen to fight them. The ground beneath her feet no longer felt fragile. It felt like hers. As she walked, memories of her childhood flickered, moments of silence, shadows being told to stay small. But they no longer hurt, they fueled her. She whispered, "I was never small. I was waiting to rise." The girl she had once been, timid and hidden, was gone. In her place was a woman carved from fire and storms. Every step forward was a vow to herself, a promise that she would never again disappear. Daniel caught up with her outside, his hands in his pockets, eyes steady. He said, "You finally stood up." Emily turned, meeting his gaze. She replied, "No, I finally stopped hiding." His lips curled into a rare small smile. He nodded once, then walked on, leaving her to the night. The exchange was brief, but it sealed the truth. She had been noticed, not for weakness but for strength. And now, she didn't need approval. She only needed herself. At the edge of the street, Emily stopped and looked up at the night sky. The stars were faint against the city glow, but they were there, like her, always present, finally seen. She whispered, "I am enough." The words carried into the night, quiet, but monumental. For years she had fought to belong, but now she understood belonging was not given. It was claimed, and she had claimed it. Her story was not finished, it was only beginning. But tonight, she stood alone, unbroken, and the silence felt like triumph.